The Weird Witch of Willow-Herb, Part 4. Kit did not reply to Princess Winsome immediately, for no one can do two things at once, and it took him quite a long time to kiss the small, soft hand that lay in his own hand. And as for going home, when they did start, they did not get very far. For it must not be forgotten that they were still in an enchanted forest, and it's easier to get into an enchanted forest than it is to get out of it again. However, as they had everything in the world to talk about, they would probably have been most annoyed if they had found their way instead of losing it. So they just went on losing it as happily as possible, until they could not walk another step, because an immense giant was occupying the whole of the roadway. There he sat, smoking a great pipe that looked like a chimney pot that wanted sweeping, and when the princess saw him, she was so frightened that she hid herself behind Kit and peeped under his arm to see what was going to happen. "Hello," said the giant in a huge voice that made the grass stand on end with fright, just as it does after a frost. "What's this? You're running away with a princess?" "To be sure I am," said Kit, "and if you don't let me pass, I shall have to kill you." "Oh dear," sighed the giant, raising a wind that made the trees shiver for miles around. "They all say that, and there's no peace for a poor giant nowadays. When I was a boy, the prince was always put under a spell, as well as the princess. However, I suppose I must make an end of you, if you're determined to fight." He laid down his pipe and rose most unwillingly to his feet. Kit laughed out loud with gladness, for at last he had found a good reason to fight, and no one would be able to call him a coward any more. But before there was time to strike a single blow, the giant gave a loud howl of alarm, took to his heels, and in another moment was completely out of sight. Kit turned in amazement to his little princess, and then he saw what had frightened the giant. For all the animals of the forest, all the lions and tigers and bears and wolves, stood there in rows waiting to help him. So there is no doubt that the giant would have been killed by somebody if he had not run away. "Isn't it wonderful?" said the little princess in a whisper, but Kit covered his face with his hands. "It is no use," he said in a disappointed tone. "The other boys will never believe that I am not a coward." Princess Winsome came and put his hand away from his eyes and laughed softly. "I think you are the bravest boy in the world," she said. "Of course he is," chuckled a voice somewhere nearby. "How stupid some people are, to be sure." And there sat the Weird Witch under a tree in her pink and green gown, and her great eyes brimful of fun and nonsense. And as the boy and girl stood hand in hand before her and caught the glance of her beautiful witch's eyes, all sorts of muddles fell out of their heads, and they began to understand everything that had been puzzling them for years and years and years. That only shows what a witch can do when she is the right sort of a witch. "Dear little princess," cried Kit, "it doesn't matter whether the other boys believe me or not, so long as you know I'm not a coward." "Besides," added Princess Winsome, "we are not going to try to make anybody believe anything. I think we'll stay here instead, for ever and ever and always." "A very good idea," smiled the Weird Witch of Willow-Herb as she nodded at them both. Always remain enchanted if you can. So they had the nicest and funniest wedding possible on that spot, and there was no time wasted in sending out invitations, for all the guests were already waiting there in rows, with the exception of the singing birds, and Kit very soon summoned them by whistling a few notes of his wonderful tune. The princess laid her own wedding breakfast under the trees, and the wedding guests helped her by bringing her everything that was so nice to eat in the forest, such as roasted chestnuts and fruits and truffles and barley sugar cane, and lots of dewdrops and honey drops and pear drops. And the Weird Witch completed the feast by turning a piece of rock that nobody wanted into a wedding cake. And as everybody will agree, that is better for a rock to turn into a wedding cake than for a wedding cake to turn into a rock. And all the flowers came out on their own accord and arranged themselves on the table, and they certainly did that much more prettily than anybody else could have ever done it. And when the wedding was over, and they just walked away again, instead of stopping until the flowers were dead, which of course is what would have been done at any other wedding, and although the bride had lost her other shoe by the time she was ready to be married, and although her beautiful hair was more untidy than ever, and her crown had tumbled off of her head again, and had to be brought to her by an obliging lion, Kit never noticed any of these things, and only felt quite certain that he was marrying somebody who had come right out of fairyland, and was not an ordinary princess at all. No doubt it was because he was in an enchanted forest that he had made such a mistake, and no doubt it is because he has never been disenchanted since that. He is making the same mistake to this very day. As for the Weird Witch of Willow-Herb, she went back to her pink cottage on the top of the hill, so to be ready to make the next person happy who came up the white, winding path. But before she went, she took care that all the singing birds should fly back to Kit's home and tell the other boys how brave he had been, which they did with great pleasure. It is said that the story became slightly exaggerated, but when we know how much one little bird can tell, it's not difficult to imagine the kind of story that could be told by hundreds and hundreds of little birds.
And now it is time for all little children to go to sleep. Good night.